and Atkinson. Super, it sounds like we've got most of the United States covered from east to west and all in between, and a lot of our New Hampshireites. So thank you guys all so much for being here. In the interest of respect for everyone's time, yours, ours, and everyone in between, we are going to start tonight's webinar. So just so you guys know, we are in full webinar mode, which means we cannot see you and we cannot hear you. So feel free to munch, crunch, sip, and slurp as you sit back and enjoy tonight's presentation brought to you by New Hampshire Audubon. I'm assuming there's a lot of you who have joined us in the past for some of our pollinator series. So for those of you who have been here before, thank you so very much for joining us again. And for those of you streaming in for the first time tonight, thanks so much for joining us and taking a part of your life to share with us this evening. Before we begin, I would like to firstly introduce myself, Willa Soroka, coming to you from New Hampshire Audubon, as well as our dear friend Diane DeLuca, who is another one of our partners in crime here at the New Hampshire Audubon organization. We're going to save our guest speaker as our secret for just a little bit longer, because before we dive into anything like hummingbirds and energy ninjas, we do want to firstly make some quick acknowledgements. So let's make sure this is going to work. Okay, cool. This presentation is streaming to you from our state headquarters in Concord, New Hampshire, which is located within the site of the ancient village of Pennacook in Endakina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. I would like to acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and our ancestors, the Alnambak, who have stewarded Endakina throughout the generations for thousands of years. New Hampshire Audubon is honored to continue the stewardship of these lands, providing opportunities for all people to form connections to the natural world through our programs and wildlife sanctuaries around the state. I invite you to learn more about the Indigenous presence on the land you occupy by visiting this website, native-lands.ca. Here you can explore and click on territories of Indigenous people and get connected to resources to learn more. And for a more in-depth understanding of the Granite State, check out all the educational resources at indigenousnh.com. So some quick Zoom information before we dive on in. We do have about 116 people registered for this evening's talk. So you'll see again that we are in full webinar mode. So you guys we can't see you, we cannot hear you. And I want you guys to feel completely welcome to use the chat, which it looks like some of us have gotten very comfortable using our chat already, for thoughts and comments and reactions or reflections that you might have throughout the duration of tonight's presentation, and reserve the question and answer button for any questions that you would specifically like answered by either tonight's presenter or by myself or Diane. Many thanks go out to the Benjamin Couch and Gertrude Couch Trust for supporting this series. We would not be able to do it without them. And before we really dive in, I'm like trying to get you guys all excited about this. So have I piqued your interest yet? We do need to talk a teeny bit about New Hampshire Audubon. So for those of you who do not know, New Hampshire Audubon is a state-based environmental nonprofit organization that is completely independent from National Audubon. And our organization here in the Granite State relies on members and donors like you to support our charitable mission, which has 4 programmatic pillars: conserving around 10,000 acres of wildlife sanctuaries throughout the state for habitat and recreation, researching trends and discovering solutions for species in peril, connecting people to nature through environmental education via school programs, field trips, summer camps, and webinars like these, and advocating for sound environmental policy in the New Hampshire State Legislature to protect the natural environment for wildlife and for people. If anyone in attendance tonight is a volunteer or a member or a supporter of New Hampshire Audubon already, I would like to sincerely thank you. We simply couldn't achieve our charitable mission without you. And if you'd like to become a part of our conservation family today, please check out our website for ways to get involved. Now that we have got all of those bases covered, I would like to pass the webinar on to Diane, who will introduce tonight's amazing presenter. I hope you guys are excited as me to meet Diane. I'll let you take it over from here.
Thanks, Willa. I'd like to give a big shout out to Willa for being the host tonight. Really appreciate that. So thank you, Willa. So we are thrilled to have Dr. Anusha Shankar sharing her knowledge of hummingbirds with us tonight. Anusha studies hummingbirds as a Rose Postdoctoral Fellow at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. She is fascinated by hummingbirds' abilities to use a hibernation-like state called torpor to save energy at night. She is investigating how they can get cold, down to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and rewarm safely every night without damaging organs like their hearts and brains. During her PhD work at Stony Brook University, Anusha captured hummingbird nightlife with infrared video and examined how hummingbirds manage their energy budgets on a daily basis. Her studies prior to hummingbirds included tracking king cobras and studying giant birds, specifically hornbills, in India. Anusha is also a National Geographic explorer and young leader and loves mentoring students, dancing salsa, bachata and swing, and reading fiction. Tonight's presentation is titled Hummingbirds Are Energy Ninjas, Day and Night. So Anusha, big thanks for sharing with us tonight. We're all really excited.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me. Willa, you're such a wonderful host. You have so much energy, and this has pumped me up for this talk. Thank you, Diane, for inviting me to give this talk, and to all of you for being here. I'll start by doing what speakers always seem to do, sharing my screen and fumbling up with the controls a little bit, while I try to cover up how fumbly I am by talking over it. And hopefully you can see my slide. I've put subtitles under here. I haven't always done this, but in case it's difficult for you to understand something I'm saying at some point, or it's just easier for you to read, hopefully this will be helpful. But I'd love your feedback at the end. I haven't done this before for a public talk, so let me know how it is. Okay. Yeah, so I study hummingbirds. I've been studying hummingbirds for the past 10 years. And sometimes I wonder why, because it's a long time to study one group of animals. And so periodically I have to take a step back and remember that we share this planet with animals like giraffes, which is so bizarre to think about sometimes, and whales and ostriches and ants. And I think hummingbirds are just one representation of the incredibleness of what the earth has to offer, and for us to experience. So yeah, it's nice to step back and think about that sometimes, that these are some of the animals that we share this planet with. I'll give you a little bit of background before I go into hummingbirds. I spent a lot of my childhood in Chennai in the southeast of India. And this is me when I was growing up, playing with some camera case. I was about, I don't know, 2 or 3 years old in this photo. And I must have liked spending time outside. I don't think I knew it was a career option, but my family did often go to parks or to wildlife sanctuaries once in a while to take a break from the city life. So I did enjoy being outside. Some of my first wildlife experiences that were, official though, were in the field with things like king cobras. So I volunteered sometime during my master's to do what's called radio tracking with king cobras. So you put this telemetry device and implant it in the snake, and then you walk around with, one of those dish antennae thing, not dish antennae, those metal antennae things that used to be on our roofs. We carried those around looking for the snake. And it would beep when we got closer and beep faster as we got closer and beep slower when we got further away from the snake. So we were trying to study the behavior of these snakes in a very fragmented agricultural landscape in India, because we were curious what kinds of habitats they prefer in these agricultural matrices. But while I was there, I started taking photos of a lot of things, and I got really, really absorbed in just paying attention to a lot of details of the world around me. There were these beautiful butterflies called the red pierrots, and they rub their back wings together like this while they're sitting. So this one did that while it was sitting on my finger. These fire ants, which have almost translucent abdomen, just all kinds of spiders, this cat snake, and even the plants there. It was just wonderful to be outside and live so far from other humans and watch the wildlife. And then this was actually an earlier experience. I volunteered at a wildlife rehabilitation center in northeastern India, in a state called Assam. And they were rehabilitating largely orphaned animals whose parents had been poached, like this black bear, this, I don't remember what it's called, Himalayan, I don't remember the species, bear, and this gibbon, the Hulak gibbon. So the gibbon was my primary, focus when I was there. I was studying this female who had been orphaned because her parents had been poached, and she was being rehabilitated to the wild. So I was studying her behavior before and after her introduction to the forest. And it was interesting because Hulak gibbons are monogamous. And so they were trying to pair this female with a wild male and get her used to his territory and get him used to her before they released her. So it was so hard for me to do fieldwork at that time. This was my first field experience living away from my family. I was there for 6 weeks. I had to cook my own food. I didn't know how to make rice or potatoes, which was the main thing I had to eat. And there were like moths flying into my food when I was cooking by candlelight. So it was a really intense experience, but I loved it because I kept going back for more, and that's still what I do. So these are some of the early experiences I had that got me hooked into wildlife biology. So eventually I went on to do a master's, and many of you might recognize this group of birds. They're called toucans, and you find them mostly in South America. An ecological equivalent in Asia and Africa are the hornbills. And so these are also giant birds, and they also often have these big beaks and structures above it called casques. So the Asian hornbills tend to be tree nesting, and so they nest in tree cavities where the female sits inside a giant tree cavity and seals it up with a mixture of her poop and some mud. And her only source of food while she's in there is the male, her mate, bringing her food. And so she spends, depending on the species, between 1.5 to 3 months secluded in that cavity. This is her only connection to the outside world. And she sheds all her feathers, molts, takes care of the young, and then leaves, and then the young leave after a bit. So I was studying how this Malabar pied hornbill, which is the species you see here, chooses its nest sites in a very agricultural landscape, again in India. Ecologists usually tend to study things in pristine protected forest or relatively pristine forest, and it's really important in a place like India to study how these animals use a very human-dominated landscape. And so I was seeing how they chose their nest sites in that kind of landscape. And again, I started taking photos of all kinds of things and paying attention to the butterflies. There's this beautiful translucent map butterfly that you find in southern India. I stumbled across this bug that was laying eggs, and just all kinds of other crazy insects that I still can't remember the name of this one. Just really bizarre purple and orange kind of insect. I also got bitten by a lot of ticks, which was so much fun. Thankfully, no Lyme disease. So then I made my way to a PhD program in the US at Stony Brook in New York. And I did field work in Arizona in the South. I see that my titles are kind of missing, sorry. So this is in the Southwest, in the eastern part of Arizona, southeastern part of Arizona, I studied hummingbirds. And I also studied them in Ecuador in South America. So Ecuador is a really tiny country where it has tons and tons of hummingbirds. So we'll finally start talking about hummingbirds. They are really, really small, and you might all know this about them. But this is the bee hummingbird, and it's the smallest bird species in the world. It weighs about 1.5 grams. And to give you a sense of how small that is, the Canadian dime weighs 1.75 grams. The Indian, now out of circulation, 10 paisa coin weighs 2 grams. And the US dime weighs 2.5 grams. So these birds weigh less than a US dime. And the average hummingbird weighs about the same as a US quarter, 25-cent coin. So they're really, really small. And they use, oh no, I don't think I did the thing. I'm gonna share again, sorry. Okay, I did do the thing. Just make sure I can see you. That's fine, Willa? Okay. So hummingbirds are really, really small. They also use up energy very, very quickly, and they barely have any backup source of energy in the form of fat. So humans can go a couple of days or weeks even without feeding because we can just burn up the fat stores that we have stored all the time. But hummingbirds don't have much of a buffer, and they're mostly feeding on sugar water all day and sometimes on insects as well to get their protein. So they have a buffer of only about a few hours, maybe 2 or 3 hours before they could be close to death. And that's the kind of energy balance that they're dealing with. They have to manage their energetic needs to not exceed that little bit of a buffer that they have. To give you a sense of how much energy they spend, if a human had the metabolic rate or the energy needs of a hummingbird, we would have to eat about 300 hamburgers every single day in order to exist. So as you get smaller and smaller, you need less, like across species, you need more and more energy per unit of your body's mass. And the opposite is also true. If we had the metabolism of an elephant, we would need like, I don't know, way less, like only 4 packets of potato chips a day instead of the usual 15. So they use up energy very quickly. Is everything okay?
You saw me going on. You are good. Can you put it back into regular screen? I think you have it set on that like high def.
Oh.
We can see your like.
Yeah, go ahead, Willa.
What can you see?
We can see the next slide that's coming up. So it's almost like it's in presenter. I know we're cheating and we're getting to see what's coming next.
That's not good.
There you go. There you go.
Okay, that should work.
There it is. Okay, perfect.
Thank you. So this is what you would have seen was coming up next. They use up energy quickly, barely have any backup source of energy, and yet they've managed to diversify into more than 330 different species across North and South America. So it's incredible to me that with the energetic constraints that they have, or at least what I see as constraints, or what a human sees as constraints, they've managed to have such a great diversity of color, of beak shape, of size. So this is that bee hummingbird we've already met, and this is the largest hummingbird, the giant hummingbird. This is the sword-billed hummingbird, which is the only bird to have a beak longer than its body. And this is my favorite, the booted racket-tail, which has tiny little white boots and goes buzzing around feeders just very adorably. I happened to see a mating display of this species in the wild, like in the forest, and I was really just rooted to the spot for a very long time. So they live in a diversity of habitats, from the cloud forests in Ecuador, like this one, to the deserts in Arizona and the high elevation Andes. So they're able to live from these really cold places and these really hot places and have such diversity of their species, despite, again, those energetic demands. So I was really curious, how do they manage their energetic needs given these constraints on a daily basis? And about the same time that I started studying hummingbirds, I started studying myself a little bit and collecting data on what I do with my day. And many of us probably do this in some way with Fitbits now. But I also started tracking my time with an app on my phone. And I found that I spend an average, this was way pre-pandemic, I spent an average of about 5% of my day on exercise, which is like 1.2 hours a day. And that's because I salsa dance like for 5 hours one day a week. And so I spend most of my day on daytime activity and a solid 8% of my day on sleeping pretty consistently. And I wanted to know how hummingbirds allocate this. If they have like just a little bit of an energy buffer, and all of the energy that they're spending is basically coming from food they just ate, how do they manage to spend that energy? And we can't put Fitbits on them, unfortunately. The Fitbits are way too big and the hummingbirds are way too small. And so we have to find other ways to study how they manage their energetic needs. So we can catch them. We use these feeder traps. So there's a feeder in the middle that we put on after setting it up like this. And then we can gently catch the hummingbird by dropping the trap and picking it out when it comes in. So this is a much less invasive way than many other ways of catching birds, but the birds don't get hurt at all. And one way to study how much energy they use is to use this doubly labeled water method. So I think it's a genius method. You can feed them or inject them with this stable isotope of water. And so it has a heavy version of hydrogen and of oxygen. And so it's not radioactive or anything like that. These are stable isotopes. And you can feed those to the bird and then let it equilibrate with the body's water. And then you collect a pee sample for a hummingbird because they have so little blood. With many other birds, you might collect a little bit of a blood sample, but you collect a pee sample and then let the bird go. And while it's away flying and doing its business for 24 hours, it's breathing out carbon dioxide and it's also peeing out water. And so it's losing oxygen two ways in both the carbon dioxide and the water, but it's losing hydrogen only one way in the pee. And so the difference between these two tells you how much carbon dioxide that bird has been breathing out in 24 hours. Then we try to catch it again and get a second pee sample. And the difference between those two is that carbon dioxide production, which gives us a measure of energy expenditure. Because most of your metabolic processes that use up energy in your body end in carbon dioxide. And so you can measure how much energy a bird has spent in the wild in 24 hours by using this double sample, doubly labeled water pee method. So we can use this to study them in different sites, like imagine in different monsoon seasons or in different landscapes, how much energy are they spending in a day is what we can find out. Again, I could get this for a human with a Fitbit, but it's just so much more complicated with a tiny little bird. So for example, we had these two sites in Arizona. One is called Harshaw and the other is called Sonoita. And Harshaw, you can see, has a lot more vegetation, a lot more shade for field assistance or for hummingbirds to take some rest from the heat. And it's a lot more elevationally diverse. Whereas Sonoita, it was much more flat and hot and dry. And so we were curious how the hummingbird's energetic needs varied in these two different landscapes, which weren't very far from each other, but they're just very different environmentally. And so I'll show you a little graph of what we found. So you'll see daily energy expenditure is along this y-axis, and the sites and different monsoon seasons are on the x-axis. So just to orient you here, Harshaw is that more green, slightly cooler, more shaded site. And Sonoita is the flatter, drier, hotter site. And we studied them pre-monsoon and then did the same thing again in the early monsoon for both sites. So the points here are individual birds that we measure daily energy expenditure from using the doubly labeled water method. And the colored points are individual birds that we caught two different times. Like twice for the 24-hour measurement in the pre-monsoon and again for the early monsoon. And so we could measure the daily energy expenditure and how it changed with the monsoon season in the same individual sometimes. So some individuals maintain the same energy needs across the monsoon season, but other ones seem to dramatically increase how much they spent energy or how much energy they spent with the onset of the early monsoon. And what really stood out to me on this graph is Sonoita Creek in the pre-monsoon versus the early monsoon. So the birds here were spending way more energy than birds in most of the other conditions. And so we were wondering like what this is because of. How can you so dramatically increase the amount of energy you're spending so that it doesn't even overlap with the individuals in the same site earlier in the monsoon? And these are just a few weeks apart, maybe 3 or 4 weeks apart. And they're dramatically increasing how much energy they spend. So again, I'm spending my measly like 1 hour a day on average on energy, and I wanted to know what they were spending their energy on. So we constructed what's called an energy budget. When is the monsoon season? I'm going to take that question. It's in usually late June to July. Usually July is when it properly starts, in the first week of July. So we can construct an energy budget by adding up the different components of what you do in a day. So for a human, I might take the amount of time and energy you spent exercising, sitting, sleeping, eating, doing the different daily activities. And on the left, you can see daily energy expenditure, which we already have measured separately from the doubly labeled water method. So each of these components on the right are the components of the energy budget. You can have basal metabolism, which is your basic existence costs. If I put you in the dark, asleep, fasted, you're not spending energy on anything except existing. That would be your basal metabolic rate. Thermoregulatory costs are the metabolic or the energy it would take to maintain a constant body temperature. Like humans, hummingbirds have to maintain a constant high body temperature during the day. And so how much energy does that take given the outside temperatures in the field? Then the activity costs, the costs of hovering, flying, and perching. And then the nighttime energy expenditure costs, how much how much energy do they spend overnight? And so this is an interesting problem for us to solve. Again, we don't have Fitbits. How do you measure how much time they're spending on different activities and how much energy those activities take? So the total daily energy expenditure is a sum of the time times the energy spent on different activities. And we don't know the time, but we can measure the energy. So we use this respirometry system to measure how much energy they spend on different parts of their activity budget. So this respirometry system has a carbon dioxide sensor, an oxygen sensor, and a water vapor sensor under the white box here. And we basically pull the breath of the hummingbird and pass it through these sensors and measure the amount of carbon dioxide consumed or the amount of carbon dioxide produced or the oxygen consumed. And again, that's a really good measure of how much energy they're spending on that activity. So if we measure them while they're hovering, we can tell how much energy they spend hovering. If we measure them at night, we get nighttime energy expenditure. So we can do this for all these different activities and construct this energy budget. The only thing we don't know here is the time they spend on different activities, but we know everything else in this equation, so we can plug it in and figure out how much time they're spending on different activities. So that's what we did. And we have the same graph from earlier, but I'm going to add some colored lines to it. So the traditional model of what a hummingbird spends its day doing was that they spend about 15% of their day hovering, 15% flying, and 75% perching. And so that's a lot of perching in a day, and that's what people who watched hummingbirds with binoculars used to think they did. So we also model some lower activity and higher activity scenarios with 5% hovering, 20% flying, 75% of the day spent perching. And we also model some super high activity scenarios just to cover our bases, assuming that they spent 80% of the day hovering and flying and 20% perching. And so we found that these different activity scenarios explained different daily energy expenditures. And what was interesting is that the only activity scenario that could explain Sonoyta Creek in the early monsoon was this super high activity scenario. So that means that these birds at some times are spending maybe 25% of their day on activity, on hovering and flying. And at other times, they're spending 80% of their day hovering and flying. And so that's a huge amount of flexibility. This is all just the same species. It's all males that we model to not, confound things with female mating and reproduction. And so what is going on in their environment? It's not really temperature that's causing these differences because temperature is within the bars. Thermoregulation is within the bars. What is causing this huge activity shift? So we went to look outside of the hummingbirds. We looked at the energy available in their landscape and how the flowers were distributed. And so in the pre-monsoon and in Harshaw, the flowers were much more abundant and clustered in clumps compared to in Sonoyta and in the post-monsoon at both sites, where the flowers were much more scarce and much more dispersed. And so the hummingbirds were probably spending much more time and energy getting between flowers and looking for flowers to feed on in the post-monsoon compared to in the pre-monsoon. To bring this back to my relatively very lazy days, I spend, like I said, an hour a day on activity, and they're spending 25 to 80% of their time which is 3 to 13 hours a day on hovering and flying. And hovering is 10 times as expensive as just sitting still. So they're spending a lot of their day when the flowers are distributed, sparsely to get between them. So that's how they're energy ninjas during the day. And now we're going to talk about the night, but if you have questions, I'm happy to pause here and talk about them a bit.
I think everybody's just digesting all of that. That was incredible. How long was that study taking, Anusha? What was that? I think I missed that at the beginning.
How long?
Yeah, how long were you actively doing that study?
That's a good question. We collected data mostly over one summer. Okay. And then it took me a while to write it and get it published and get it past the reviewers, who had some good suggestions, but had a lot of criticism as well, as usual.
Understandable. Right on. We do have a question that's coming in right now. And the question was, when you were referring to capturing the breath from a hummingbird, how does one do that? What was the material used? Was it, yeah.
Yeah, so it depends on what they've been doing while we're trying to measure them. If it's at night or it's at different temperatures, then we can put them in a chamber and we push outside air in, and we pull the air from the chamber out with a pump. And that pump pushes it then to our respirometry system. When they're hovering, it's cool because we don't even have to catch them. We can go set up a feeder outside, like anyone has their feeder in their backyard. We can use one of those feeders, and they often have that, that artificial flower. We can drill a hole and put a tube in there and put that to be right about where the nostrils would be of the hummingbird, and pull the breath as they hover in the outside.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
People come up with the greatest things. I didn't do any of that discovery or invention.
Awesome. Oh my gosh. And then we have another question. Which season has the most flowers down in Arizona?
I actually think it's way post-monsoon. So we studied pre-monsoon and just after the rains had started in the early monsoon. I think the post-monsoon has way more flowers, but we didn't get that far in our study. It's really hard to catch them when it's so rainy and to do anything when it's so rainy. So in this context, the pre-monsoon had more flowers than the early monsoon. Yeah, I think then it would go back up later on.
Awesome. And we have some other folks in the chat that are saying, I'm still trying to wrap my head around how it was happening. So I think everyone's just digesting.
Okay, we'll move on then. I'll reiterate some of those methods as we proceed.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm not at that slide. Where am I? Okay, what they do at night. So I'm kind of stupid about this. I give it away in the little blurb that I send. Sorry, one sec. I'm not able to get this. Okay. There we go. Yeah, what do they do at night? Because they're not feeding on flowers. They're not getting any energy input. And I already told you, if they don't feed for a few hours, sometimes they could be on the verge of dying. And so how do they manage to make it through the night? They use a strategy called Torpor. And this is what I've become kind of obsessed with for many years now. And this is what I spend all my time studying. They get cold and save energy. And how do we study this? So one way to study it is to use this third method. I've told you about doubly labeled water and respirometry. And this is thermal imaging, where we use this fancy camera that's usually used on for military drones or something like that. And we point it at these tiny little hummingbirds to look at what their surface temperatures are and how they change overnight. And so we can get some really cool video like this. So I'll orient you first. This asterisk is where the hummingbird's eye is, and this is the tail, and this is the beak. And so this hummingbird in this video is asleep. It's at a high body temperature. It's breathing. Its heart is beating pretty quickly. And so we use the surface of the surface temperature around the eye as a good measure for what's going on inside the body of the hummingbird. because there's not much feather density around the eye, so it's not very insulated and we can see through to the skin. So it's a good proxy for what's going on inside the body. And this is the same hummingbird later that night in torpor, and you have to squint to see that hummingbird because here's the beak, here's the eye, here's the tail. It's the same temperature as the outside air. And so its body is dropped down to like 15 degrees Celsius or somewhere in the 50s Fahrenheit. And it's saving a bunch of energy by doing that. It takes a lot of energy to maintain a high body temperature. And they allow their temperature to drop and they become like ectotherms, like snakes or lizards, right? And they save energy. So during the day, they have among the highest metabolic rates of all vertebrates, all animals with a backbone. And at night, they can drop their energy to be 5% or 10% of what it was when it was asleep. And so they're able to go through this change, sometimes every night, depending on the species. Their whole body cools down and they warm back up in the morning and hover and go about their day as if nothing happened. So this was just such a crazy strategy to me that you can spend 5% of the energy you were spending when you were asleep and still be alive was incredible to me. And I wanted to know what was going on inside their bodies that allowed them to save so much energy. So to give you some sense of scale for how big this temperature difference is, a normal human maintains an average body temperature of about 98 degrees Fahrenheit. I think I'll talk in Fahrenheit because everyone's based in the US, as we saw. And hypothermia would mean when your body temperature has dropped to 95 degrees Fahrenheit or below, and you can't warm yourself back up by yourself. You need external warm heat to warm yourself back up, usually. And so this difference of just 3 degrees Fahrenheit is enough to like knock us out. Hummingbirds are maintaining a normal body temperature of 106 degrees Fahrenheit. And in torpor, the coldest a hummingbird has been known to go is 3 degrees Celsius. This is a species from Peru. Usually they go to about 10 degrees Celsius or somewhere in the high 40s Fahrenheit. So they're maintaining a minimum body temperature, the coldest of 37 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a difference of 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And they're perfectly happy the next day. Like their heart doesn't stop functioning. They remember where the flowers are. Their brain keeps functioning. Their liver keeps, it's just incredible to me that they can go through this change sometimes every night, warm themselves back up and then be normal again. So I would really want to know what's going on in their organs, what's going on with the genes that they're expressing or not expressing to allow them to exist. We know that their hearts keep beating in torpor, but really slowly. We know that they breathe in torpor, but really slowly. So I've watched them with these thermal images or thermal video, and they seem to take like no breaths for 10 seconds or something like that, and then take 4 deep breaths in torpor, and then take no breaths again for 10 seconds. So they have this very sporadic breathing pattern in some cases, and their hearts are beating at a really low rate. If you did this to a human, you cooled us down, first of all, we'd die. But if we didn't die, our hearts would like not function normally. They would be tachycardic or bradycardic. They'd be like firing off in random ways. And we'd probably lose a lot of brain cells and a lot of memory. And so they don't do all that. They wake up the next morning and they're fine. Studying animals that use torpor can be really useful for a bunch of things that are human oriented, not just for understanding how animals work. A lot of medical researchers are working on safely cooling human bodies down. This is especially useful in stroke and cardiac patients because you can slow down the damage to these organs by making them colder and lowering their metabolism. And then dealing with the problem, having more time to do the surgery and then warming them back up. But humans are hard to cool down safely. And if we understand how other animals are able to do this without having damage to their organs, it could be really useful for surgery. It could also be useful for preserving organs. So for organ transplants, if you can cool organs down, keep them cold for a longer time without getting damaged, that's obviously going to save a lot of time and save a lot of organs from going to waste. And another very sci-fi application that I like to think about is human hibernation for space travel, which I feel like is getting more and more possible given all of the private companies that are getting invested in this. But NASA, I've been to scientific conferences where NASA has had symposia to talk about human hibernation and what we need to know to get that to become a reality. So obviously it would take up a lot less weight on spacecrafts if we could make humans not need food or air or just like not need to poop. We'd also prevent them from killing each other, because if imagine you're on a plane or on a spacecraft for 50 years with the same people. I would go very crazy. So hibernating might be a good way. Yeah, so I just a couple of other curious things. I got really obsessed with hummingbird pee during my PhD because it was data, and I could collect doubly labeled water information on their energy expenditure every time I got a pee sample. So every time a hummingbird would pee, even if it was on my face or on my hands, I would get so excited and I'd ask someone to collect it. We also got some really fun videos of hummingbird. This hummingbird is asleep, its eyes are closed, but it's preening and arranging its feathers at night. And just a lot of pee. I have this on loop. It's just peed once, but I loved seeing hummingbirds pee. I also studied with someone who used to be a student of mine, is now a PhD student in Canada. He and I got this crowdfunded grant, which people contributed money to for us to be able to buy these thermal cameras. And we looked at nesting female hummingbirds. They're the only ones that take care of the chicks and the eggs. And we wanted to know if they use torpor at night, because if they get cold, then it could affect the development of their offspring, and their chicks could get slowed down in their development or even die. So we wanted to know if the females prioritize the thermal, keeping their chicks warm over keeping themselves warm. Sorry, keeping themselves cold and using torpor. So this is a female hummingbird feeding its chicks. We found that they avoid using torpor for the large part. There were only a couple of nights out of 108 nights that we studied these nesting females when they used torpor, and they just used it for like an hour or two, only when it was super rainy and everything got cold. So they seem to really prioritize the development of their babies. So I'll end with a couple of suggestions for things that you could do to be more involved. I mean, you're all here, so you clearly go outside and watch things. But if you could go spend 15 or 20 minutes outside every few days and just pay attention to the living things around you, I think that can help all of us. There's so many ways now to identify living beings you don't know the identities of. So there's iNaturalist, which is an app where you can contribute citizen science data by taking pictures and IDing plants, insects, animals, literally anything that's alive, and upload it to this wonderful resource. There's also, if you have young people in your life, there's this incredible initiative that a friend of mine started called Reserva Youth Land Trust. She's trying to buy rainforest in Ecuador and protect it. And it's a completely youth-run organization. So she's trying to empower young people to know that they can raise money to protect the planet too. And it's not just up to old policymakers. So I can send you these links, Willa, if that's useful, but there's a bunch of citizen science projects like at the Lab of O, where I'm based, at the Lab of Ornithology. There's like a whole team of people working to develop this app called eBird. Many of you might already use it, but if you don't, it's a wonderful resource. And there's another app by the lab called Merlin, which I don't have on this list right now. You can use it to sound ID birds when you go for your walks. If you hear a bird song, you can use Merlin to help you identify what that bird species is, which is awesome. They just released the Europe extension for the sound ID app for Merlin. There's also a bunch of really cool citizen science projects that you can contribute to. So I've spent like a few hours doing this one day, but people have taken these drone or satellite pictures of these are not hummingbirds, penguins. And you can go and say, this is a penguin, this is a penguin, this is a penguin. And it helps them automate their machine learning tools and also automate how to identify penguins from these giant databases. So there's a bunch of projects on pollinators included on zooniverse.org. You can help people trace these scans of bird skulls on markmybird.org. And again, there's iNaturalist, and there's a whole compilation of projects on National Geographic Citizen Science page. If any of you are educators and want more ideas, I'm in touch with a few educators who've run some of these for their students. There's also BioBlitz for students, where students can contribute to crowdfunding programs. But yeah, those are just some of the ways that everyone can be involved in helping science happen. Those data are used by many scientists. A lot of organizations have given me money to do the things I do, and I'm super thankful to them for doing that, and to all the people who have helped me do this work. And you can find me online or ask me questions, I hope, lots of questions now.
Thanks, Anusha. That was great. So there are a number of questions. And I'm just the face, so if Willa wants to jump in, feel free. But David asked, what is the respiratory rate for a hummingbird? I'm assuming it would be different depending on the size, but in general, what's their respiratory rate?
You know, I'm so bad at remembering what's the respiration rate and what's the heart rate and what's the wing beat. I always get confused. I think it's 30 to 50 breaths a minute. Does that make sense? No, I think it's way more than that. You know, I'm going to look it up. You can ask me the next question.
Okay. You know what triggers the body temperature changes? Is it dark or daylight?
Yeah, they do not seem to do this during the day because they would be really susceptible to predators. They seem to do it at night. And it's a really good question of what triggers it. So for the longest time, people have studied torpor only in relation to temperature, really, and thinking that cold temperatures would trigger torpor. But it really seems more internal. It seems like an interaction of things, but it seems like there's a fat threshold that they hit, which is when they enter torpor. That seems to be the proximate thing triggering torpor entry. So the same student of mine, who's now a PhD student who studied the nesting female hummingbirds, Eric, he studied birds that were pre-migration and getting, like, not in the migration season and getting ready for migration. And they seem to change the fat threshold at which they enter torpor. And so there's so many things influencing it, but like normally when they hit 4% body fat, they would enter torpor. And when they're getting ready for migration, they really need to bulk up and to increase their body energy stores. And so they seem to enter torpor at 30% body fat instead. They use torpor as a way to save more and more energy and put on more fat. Because these ruby-throated hummingbirds that we get here, they're 3 grams when they leave like before. And then when they're getting ready for migration, they double their body weight and become 6 grams before they leave Mexico to make it across the Gulf. So they use torpor, it seems like, to increase the fat stores.
Wow. Have you studied any of the energetics of hummingbird migration? I
have not, but okay, hummingbirds breathe 250 breaths a minute, it looks like. I think that sounds right, 250 to 300.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And then in torpor, it's close to like 10 or 30 beats a minute, breaths a minute. Yeah, so I haven't studied hummingbird migration and the energetics of it. There's people who've studied more. There was a recent paper on the giant hummingbird and its migratory route, because the giant hummingbird is the one hummingbird that's big enough that they actually were able to put a GPS tag on it. And so it's a really cool path in Peru that they have for those giant hummingbird individuals.
Wow. So Walter's asking, who are the predators?
It's so hard to study. I think the general understanding is that snakes, crows, owls, and some raptors are the ones that predate on hummingbirds. Eric was seeing with his cameras that there were a lot of crows. His was like on a university campus, and it seems like crows were predating on especially the chicks. That seems to be the most susceptible time of their lives when they're in the nest.
So Anusha, there are a number of questions about supporting hummingbirds and hummingbird feeders. So I'll read out a couple of them. So Bob asks, I put up hummingbird feeders as well as having perennials that seem to attract them. How soon should I put the feeders up? I'm assuming they migrate, but with the extended colder temperature here, I'm worried that they may need sooner than later. I've noticed that the birds that have been coming to my suet feeders are consuming a lot more this spring.
There's usually these predictive maps where you can look for when a hummingbird species is migrating up. And they have these bands to show you the different months that they're predicted to come to different states. I would guess that they're going to come up relatively soon now, but I don't know if they've started yet. I haven't heard of anyone spotting one here quite so far north yet. But that's the best way as a longer term strategy to look for those predictive maps every year and see when the hummingbird migration is predicted.
Yeah, so Journey North is an organization that does follow, and Becky's putting in, there's been one ruby-throated sighting in New Hampshire so far this year. I think Becky, share again, but I think it's usually around the 10th of May or so where we get a lot of movement for migration for ruby-throated hummingbirds. So another question, how can we best support hummingbirds in our yards? If you would recommend supplying food, what are the best food sources? Is refined white sugar, which some recommend mixed with water, really good for them?
Yeah, you can definitely put feeders up. I think the easiest low maintenance way if you have a garden is definitely to plant hummingbird pollinated plants. That helps the ecosystem if you plant native species more than having feeders would. But you can definitely use feeders. It's such a complicated topic to me because I feel like we're just supplying them with an artificial food resource, and we don't fully know if that's affecting their visitation to other native plant species. It doesn't seem to really like lower pollination rates, but definitely native plants are the best way to go. And the second best way to go is to put feeders up. A good ratio, I know there were some questions about the nectar. A good ratio to use is 1 cup sugar to 4 cups water. Many people boil the water so that there's no particulate matter and harmful things left in the water. Boil it, let it cool, and then you can use it over a few days by putting it in the fridge. But you have to really be careful to clean the feeders. It's very, very easy in the summer for it to get fungus. And if you see any black stuff on the feeder, that's fungus, and that can really harm the hummingbirds. There's many wildlife rehabilitators that have to deal with hummingbirds that are sick because of that fungus. So if you can't keep a clean feeder, don't put a feeder up for sure. And don't use any dyes. There's no need for the dye. Usually the feeders are already red enough that the hummingbirds will find them. It might take a few weeks, but yeah, don't use red dye and definitely keep your feeders clean. Sometimes that might need cleaning every day or every 2 days.
Thanks, Anusha. So to follow up on that, Nina's asking, do hummingbirds know what are native flowers versus non-native in different areas? Wondering about what flowers are best to have in an area to support them. Often big box stores provide flowers and state that they're good for hummingbirds, but if non-native, are they?
That's a good question. I don't know if the hummingbirds would be able to differentiate. So like in South America, sometimes the hummingbirds are adapted to different flowers, like they have beak shapes and beak sizes that'll match the flower in a particular season, but often they're also able to be more general, and the flowers with really short corollas that are straight, most hummingbirds are able to feed from them. If there's a flower with a really curved corolla, maybe a ruby-throated hummingbird won't be able to get in. Sometimes they flower pierce and drink from the back, but it really depends on the species. So I don't think it would make a difference to the hummingbird, but it might not be great for the rest of the ecosystem and for the plants, the actually native plants, to use non-native plants in your yards. So I think to this region, the bee balm and salvia might be native. Those are the most common ones that I've heard of being planted in the Northeast. Tom says the globe thistle.
Yeah, Lonicera, Eastern columbine, those are all 2 other native plants that they tend to go to pretty readily. Suzanne wanted to add to Nina's question, and that is about flowers that are treated with systemic pesticides and whether you know the effect of the neonics on hummingbirds.
I don't know if that's been studied yet with hummingbirds. I know people who are studying it in bats, and I think those same people are working on studying those effects of neonicotinoids in hummingbirds. I'm going to guess it's not good. from how it's affecting the bats, and they get slower, they're not able to fly as well, their memory might be affected. So it doesn't seem like the neonicotinoids are good for other flying species.
Lee's wondering, how high in the tree do ruby-throated hummingbirds nest?
That's a good question. I have never found a hummingbird in the wild nesting, but then I haven't looked. So that study with the female hummingbirds was with the Allen's hummingbirds on the West Coast, and those were pretty low because it was a very bushy environment. It really depends on the environment. I think very often, if they can, they'll nest pretty high and they'll roost pretty high. But it kind of depends on what's there in that environment. I was studying them in a very shrubby, high elevation environment, but then nothing was more than that much taller than my height. So they would nest at whatever they had. Here, I'm sure they nest much higher as well.
Yeah, I've seen them like halfway up the tree. They can nest pretty high. So David's, we're going back now to some of your studies, and he's wondering, is their urine different from ours?
That's a good question. It's not as yellow. Very often they drink so much nectar in a day that their pee is like pretty clear. And once I was really curious, and I often measure the sugar concentration of the nectar just to check that it's the right amount. And we have this thing called a refractometer that can tell you the sugar concentration. And so we were feeding them maybe like 8 or 10% sugar, sometimes 30% sugar, depending on the study. And their pee was always like 0% sugar. So they're able to process all the sugars that they get, and they don't get diabetic, which is super interesting. They have some really cool things for how they transport sugar in their bodies that doesn't let them get diabetic. But their pee, yeah, I think it's very similar. The one main difference is that we have different openings for the solids and the liquids, and they have one. So pretty like 2/3 of the way down their gut, their kidneys dump into the rest of the digestive system. And so it mixes up the pee with the poop. And so they can actually reabsorb more from the pee from the digestive tract before spitting it all out through their cloaca.
Wow, that's fascinating. So Joseph's wondering, is there any theory on why hummingbirds haven't figured out if they didn't hover so much, they wouldn't have to work as hard?
That's a good question. Like, I wonder if I could just be lazier and not work as hard. But we still do, you know. I'm fuzzy, sorry. This happens. Okay. I think it's largely because of the flowers that they feed on. So like I told you, the toucans and the hornbills are ecologically convergent, but evolutionarily very different in North South America versus in Africa and Asia. And hummingbirds are very similar with sunbirds that way. So hummingbirds are only in North and South America, and sunbirds are in Africa and Asia. And sunbirds are nectarivores, and they kind of feed on insects, and they perform all the same functions as hummingbirds, but they're evolutionarily pretty distinct. So they're part of this group called passerines, or the perching birds, and hummingbirds are not. And they perch all the time. So I think it's because of the flowers that the hummingbirds feed on. They're really delicate, and there's no way to like hold on to the stems of many of the flowers that they feed on. So I think they kind of have to hover to feed on some of the flowers on some of the food resources they have. And I think it might also be related to their mating displays and to their aggression, that they have to be able to respond really quickly. So it is a trade-off. Being able to hover is really energetically expensive, but it must have some advantage for them to spend so much energy to keep doing it.
Yeah, that's fascinating again. So Barbara said, here in the Northeast, where do hummingbirds spend the night?
I don't know. Probably in a tree branch somewhere. So there's only one study in the 1970s that found a hummingbird roosting outside and measured it and saw that it was using torpor. And that was one paper based on one hummingbird individual in the 1970s. And otherwise, scientists haven't published about finding hummingbirds in the wild. So it's really hard to say if they're not in nests where they're spending the night. But it's in trees. That much we know from watching them.
And just a follow-up question. I was curious because you said that when you were showing us the hummingbird and the heat emanating from them, and you said that hummingbird is sleeping because the eyes are closed, but it was preening. So how do you distinguish that? Like when they close their eyes, they're definitely sleeping?
Yeah, they do tend to close their eyes and sleep. So you can, I mean, I've watched a lot of them overnight with these thermal videos, and you can see that like in the beginning of the night, they're really restless and they're not used to the chamber that we put them in. So they're flapping around, and then they're like, okay, fine, I guess I'll settle down. And then they sit. And then they usually keep their head up in this pose with their beak facing up and their tail facing down. And they're in this like straight line kind of axis. And they'll do some little fluffy things and they'll open their eyes and look around a little bit, but then eventually they'll close their eyes and their metabolism will drop a little bit. Their body temperature will drop a tiny bit, which shows that they're sleeping. And so that preening, I think, happened at like 1 a.m. or something, which is usually when all of them are asleep.
Oh, that's really interesting. So Barbara says it seems they could conserve energy if they didn't squabble so much with each other. Do we know why?
Yeah, I mean, my explanation personally is that they have such energetic demands that they need to, well, not all species do this. So it really depends on the food resources in that area and on the species size and all kinds of other things. But some of them are very aggressive. And I think that's kind of the only way in some places to make sure that you get the food that you need. There are feeders in Ecuador, like the video that I showed you, where there's like 8 different species and over 30 different individuals at one feeder. And some of them are being aggressive to each other and others are just like coming in and going out and minding their own business. So it really depends on the species. Not all of them are really aggressive. And some of them are aggressive sometimes and not at other times. It depends on how the food resources are. So it's like, is it worth defending? Is it worth spending energy fighting others to maintain my access to this food resource? Or are things so abundant or so scarce that it's not worth defending is, I think, the question they're answering all the time.
So follow up from Bob, what I've noticed is that the hummingbird pair, they're very territorial, so I'm sure that they are the same as observed, go to flowers first and use my feeders as backup. Although flowers die, the ones I've observed seem to be not so finicky. Clearly, they prefer the hollyhock to the petunia, but I've seen them go to both.
I think they do prefer flowers over the feeders. It does seem like a backup source in many places. At my field sites in Ecuador, I lived in one place for 7 months in the high elevation Andes. They weren't used to the feeders there, and they just didn't come to them. Like, it was such a pain to get them to come to the feeders to try to trap them. They would just sit on my mist nets on my feeders and laugh at me. Because they didn't want it. They were like, I have enough flowers. I don't need this nonsense.
That's really interesting. So Anne shares out Lobelia cardinalis, the cardinal flower, is also another good native for hummingbirds. And Sandy's wondering, how fast can a hummingbird come out of torpor to escape a predator?
That's a very good question. So I didn't show this, but I usually have a slide that shows the different levels of torpor they go into and the trade-offs. So by not going into torpor, you're spending a lot of energy, but you can remain responsive to outside air and like outside stimuli. If you're in torpor, it takes a hummingbird like 20 to 30 minutes to come out of it, even if they've been disturbed, because they have to warm their bodies all the way back up to normal, and that takes time. So they really can't do anything if something's trying to eat them if they're in torpor. Many hibernating animals, so hibernation is like a multi-day or multi-week version of daily torpor, and torpor is the umbrella term for all of these things. Many hibernating animals do the hibernation in burrows, so that they aren't susceptible to predation because it does take so long to warm back up, even longer for a hibernator than for a hummingbird. Yeah, 20 to 30 minutes is the answer.
Wow. So Nina asks, is there any way to tag a hummingbird to figure out some of these questions?
Kind of. So with some of the slightly larger hummingbirds, if they're like if they weigh like a quarter or a little bit more, people have been able to put radio tags on them, like I put on the king cobras, or I didn't put them, some veterinarian put them, and I just followed them. But people have put radio tags on some hummingbirds and followed them through the forest. And then with the giant hummingbird, they were able to put the GPS tags and use satellites to track the movement of those hummingbirds. The ideal thing for me to use would be an accelerometer, which is like what your phones have. If you turn it sideways, your phone flips to landscape mode. And that's because it has an accelerometer. So it detects motion in the 3 different dimensions. And if we could make, the accelerometers are actually small enough. They weigh very, very little. But to store data from them and to power them with the battery takes a lot of weight. And those aren't small enough to put on hummingbirds yet. So it depends on the type of tag. There are some things called pit tags that people have implanted in hummingbirds, where it gives the hummingbird a unique ID. And every time it comes to a feeder that has a pit tag reader, you can identify the individual that came to that feeder and when it came there and how long it was there and what it fed on and how much it weighed and all kinds of things.
That's great. So this is probably a good question to kind of wrap up. Becky's wondering, what's next? What are you studying now?
Yeah, I'm studying what's going on inside their bodies, like what's going on in their heart and their lungs and their brains that's allowing them to save energy, so much energy, and still remain alive in torpor. And so I'm looking at what genes they express in these different tissues at different metabolic states, when they're in sleep or when they're in torpor, what's going on inside their bodies that's saving them so much energy, but still keeping them alive. And eventually I want to move to India and study birds there. That's my long-term goal.
Thanks, Anusha. This was really wonderful. And I will pass it back to Willa so that she can be the face of Audubon and share out. But thank you so much for sharing all this
great information. This was such a wonderful audience.
Yeah, this was incredible. There was one more question, Day, and I hope you don't mind. I jumped backwards because I had the same one as Julie, who had asked, if the females do not use torpor at night when caring for their chicks, how do they maintain their energy needs?
Yeah, this is a good question. So we did some modeling, and it seems like the nest is what's helping them because it lowers the cost of having to stay warm by keeping them warmer. And so it makes it cheaper for them to not go into torpor every night. But they must be doing something like feeding on way more energy in the evenings before coming to the nest to be able to power themselves a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, right on. And then I have one more. I hope you guys are cool. I'm sitting here like, oh my gosh, I have 100, but I'm trying to limit it. So I jumped on hers, and now I've got one for myself of how long are they on average in that state of torpor in the evening hours? Like what's the average amount of time?
So it depends on that fat threshold, like when they hit it, and they seem to enter at different times of night depending on that fat threshold. They always come out about an hour before sunrise. That seems pretty fixed. And so depending on the length of the night, sometimes they can be in torpor for 1 or 2 hours, or sometimes for like 8 hours.
Oh my gosh. See, that's what that's amazing. That's absolutely incredible.
And then there's ground squirrels that are in hibernation for 8 months.
Right. And we got our resident groundhog here in New Hampshire, who's our only true hibernator. And I'm sure all of us fellow gardeners have been noticing they are back and active and hungry. So Anusha, thank you so much. Thank you everyone who joined us tonight. I hope you had as much fun as I did. This was so engaging and so mind-boggling. And I think I can speak for all of us when I say we have a new appreciation for our tiny ruby-throated energy ninjas. Thank you guys all so very much. We hope that you'll be able to join us for our next Pollinator series webinar. I should be able to rattle off the date from the top of my head, but it's still flittering with hummingbirds, so you'll have to check our website instead. Feel free to head on to newhampshireaudubon.org and check out our event calendar to register for the next Pollinator series. Anusha, thank you. Best of luck with your continued research and exploration. You are such an inspiration.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We hope to be in touch. I will definitely be in touch so we can talk kids and getting them involved in the sciences. Thank you so very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Take care. Happy spring. All right.